Bill, you ready to launch?
I'm gonna, yeah,
Okay, great.
I'm on the pad.
All right. Welcome, everyone. It's really nice to have you here on this uh, day full of weather here in Santa Barbara and up at our Santa Barbara Zen Center. Even though we don't have a permanent guiding teacher here at our Zen Center, we're fortunate to be able to bring guiding teachers and priests in through Zoom and sometimes to visit us. But also we have a lot of people that have been studying this path for many, many years and teaching this path as well. And we're fortunate today that Bill Powell, who is a professor emeritus, I think, from UCSB in Asian studies. I always get this wrong, so correct me.
East Asian.
East Asian studies is gonna be our presenter today, and we've been talking about sutras and chants, and in the past, in some of our conversations here, and the Heart Sutra is one of the most famous, and we see it in so many Zen centers as kind of an anchor of chanting and practice, and it's at first reading, the first time you read it, it's like it's wonderful, and then the more you read it, the more in some ways complex and mysterious in some ways it becomes. So
Yes.
there's a very, very well-known translation by Red Pine of the Heart Sutra, and Bill is going to be good enough to kind of walk through his thoughts on some of the Heart Sutra that may be helpful to us as we chant and practice with it. And Bill, before you get started, I was thinking, because we have some new folks here today, that we might go around and have everyone introduce themselves, if that'd be helpful, and then
Yeah.
we'll turn the floor over to you.
Okay.
All right. So Michael, and we'll go in that direction.
Hi, everybody. I'm Michael.
I'm Michael.
Been practicing probably since April or so.
I'm Erin. I've been with you just a few times. I'm Elisa.
I'm Peter.
I'm Riley.
Ryan.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you. I'm Emmy. I've been sitting with the group for some years. Glad to be here.
I'm Mark, a recent addition, but a cafeteria Buddhist from way back.
I'm Ben. This is my first time here.
Nice to have you here, Ben.
I'm Ken, newcomer of about 50 years.
Yeah.
Timothy.
Hi, Timothy. I'm Dave. Like Emmy, I've been with this group for a number of years. We have a few folks with us on screen, and would you mind introducing yourselves? Bob, can we start with you?
Bob here.
Hi, I'm Olivia. Nice to meet you, and I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but next time.
All right.
Mm.
Welcome. It's nice to meet you.
I'm Susan Tova. I've been with the group a long time.
And a board member too, I believe. Is that right? Yeah. Good to have you here. All right. We will turn our program over to Bill. Bill, thank you so much.
Yeah.
In advance.
Yeah. Okay, now for the easy. Okay. First, we're going to look at the Heart Sutra. Just introduce it because there's too much in it. It could take the rest of the year to go through the rest of the text. So I'm just going to introduce it, and it's not going to be very profound, but hopefully it'll map out the territory. And if we get time, I'd love to go into some of these sections more deeply than with everybody. But right now, let's just get an overview and get a sense of where it's going and what it's about. So that the name of this movement is the Prajnaparamita, which we recite every time we come here. All Buddhas throughout space and time. All Buddha, Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, Maha Prajna Paramita. Comes at the end of that. We recite that every time. That's a movement. It was the initial movement that brought Mahayana into existence about the 2nd century BCE. And So the first text that came out, and that was about the 1st century BCE, and that's what I have this one. I wonder if this hot tea will bring my voice down to octaves. The first Prajna Parami, that didn't work. First Prajna Paramita text that came out was the Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 lines. In its first summary. This was produced probably around the 1st century BCE, maybe into Common Era. So this is a manageable size, 8,000 lines, that's not so bad. But the first thing that happened, I'm going to stack these. I can get my books higher actually. That was the first one that came out. That was translated by Edward Konza. And he was the primary student and introducer of the entire body of Prajna literature to the English-speaking world. Of course, he'd been around in Asia for a long time. Then it began to expand. It went to 18,000 lines, 20,000 lines, 50,000 lines, 100,000 lines. This is probably around the 30,000 line level. This was also translated by Edward Konza. So we can begin to make a pyramid here. I'm not going to suggest we read these today. This is just a visual exercise. So there's a modestly long one. They get much longer than this. This is the next one. Then it went the other way. It went down to shrink. They began to shrink it into a more manageable size. And the next thing that soon after these came out, the 300 line version called the Diamond Sutra came out. And this is, we're getting down in size. It's a little bit more manageable there now. This actually includes the Heart Sutra, but the Heart Sutra is only about 8 pages in here. The Diamond Sutra is the rest of it. And then, where does it stop? This is the Heart Sutra. That's the whole sutra. Compare that to 300 or 20,000 lines. So there's a huge body of texts. This is what's on the top. Like that. And actually, once Tibet and even Indian Tantra got involved, they boiled it down to one word. That's the whole sutra in one word. But it's Tantric Buddhism. So it is the foundation for many of the other texts that come out in Mahayana, actually that we deal with. And the Heart Sutra is probably more heard and studied in Japan than any place else in the world. It's recited constantly, it's studied constantly in monasteries, and is a foundation for most Zen monasteries as well. It's, as we recited here, first thing we recited was the Heart Sutra. This is common throughout Japan. So what's going on with this book? How did it become so complete, so dominant in East Asia? Not so much in other parts of, although every place. There are actually 38 versions of this in Sanskrit. And then after that, you translate it into Mongolian, Tocharian, and various other Central Asian languages. gets up into the 50s and 60s versions of these texts. So there's a huge body of text. And it's responsible for where we go with a lot of the Chan and Buddhist, Zen Buddhist understandings come from this. So I'm mostly going to read excerpts from Red Pine's translation and his commentary. And I'll stop when somebody has a question, but I'll be jumping back and forth through different sections here. I'll be show and tell things. I gotta find my glasses so I can see what I'm doing.
Bill? Yeah. The 30 to 60,000 lines, is that an interpretation of, or
It's not an interpretation, it's an elaboration.
an elaboration?
And a lot of it gets redundant, obviously, once you get up to 100,000. And it would be in many volumes, but it would be one sutra. And they're similar, but sometimes Subhuti is the one who's talking to the teacher, to the Buddha, actually. But the Heart Sutra, as you know, it's Avalokiteshvara, Bodhisattva. It's the only sutra the Bodhisattva is addressed and doing the teaching. So we'll get into that, into who the Bodhisattva is. It's Avalokiteshvara, but what his role is. And the question comes up, what is, when we recite at the start of today, all Buddhas throughout space and time, what's Prajnaparamita doing in there with all these Buddhas and Bodhisattvas? So that's something that will come up as we go through the survey. So I'm going to read Red Pine's Locating Sutra in History, the History of Buddhism. And this is in his introduction. The Heart Sutra is Buddhism in a nutshell. It covers more of the Buddha's teachings in a shorter span than any other scripture, and it does so without being superficial or commonplace. I can say that again. It's not commonplace at all. Although the author is unknown, he was clearly someone with a deep knowledge of the Dharma and an ability to summarize lifetimes of meditation in a few well-crafted lines. This is Red Pine speaking now. Having studied the Heart Sutra for the past year, I would describe it as a work of art as much as religion. And perhaps it is one more proof, if any were needed, that distinguishing these two callings is both artificial and unfortunate. Whoever the author was, he begins by calling upon Avalokiteshvara, Buddhism's most revered bodhisattva, to introduce the teaching of the Prajnaparamita, the perfection of wisdom, to the Buddha's wisest and most precocious student, disciple, Shariputra. Avalokiteshvara then shines the light of this radical form of wisdom on the major approaches to reality used by the Sarvastivadins, the most prominent Buddhist sect in North India and Central Asia 2,000 years ago, and outlines the alternative approach of the Prajnaparamita. Finally, Avalokiteshvara also provides a key by means of which we can call this teaching to mind and unlock its power on our behalf. So this is a common understanding among many students of Buddhism in the West. Now, The next thing I want to read is the major figure who introduced the Prajnaparamita to the West began translating all these volumes, was Edward Konza. He was my professor for the 2 or 3 years he was at Berkeley. Bob, you'll appreciate this. The classes were wild at Berkeley. when I was there. They knew that he translated these books. So the first class, I remember the first class I went to, which was Introduction to Buddhism, taught by Edward Konza. It was one of those large auditoriums in Berkeley on a major campus. And it was overflowing. People were sitting on the floor like this. Some people, a woman came in with a monkey on her back. That monkey. He sat right here next to Konza was lecturing right here. We had this huge auditorium, and here was this young woman with a monkey.
What year would this have been?
That would be 19. Oh, wow, when did I go there? 75, I think. It sounds familiar.
I knew the girl with the monkey. No.
Oh, I love an introduction. So there was this large crowd. People were sitting on the steps coming down the aisles, and it was absolutely packed. And Konza is an irascible son of a gun. The first thing he did, he looked down at the girl with the monkey and says, "Leave this classroom." So he threw her out. And he then proceeded to insult all kinds of people. So if you want an entertainment, any synopsis on this guy Konza, go to Wikipedia, Edward Konza. He was a communist for the first half of his life in Germany with the Nazis. He escaped Germany in 1937. He fled to Spain to the revolutionaries there, and he said, "No, they're crazy. They all carry guns, and they wanted me to carry a gun." So he went to England, where he'd grown up because his father was a German diplomat. So he had a place he could go in England, and he spent the rest of his life in England and turned from the Marxist dialectical materialism to Buddhist dialectical. And he said, Mao Zedong on resolving conflict among the masses is right out of the Prajnaparamita. Constantly offensive.
What does it mean?
What does what mean?
What, you said some German word, I think?
No, they don't.
No.
Mao Zedong,
Oh,
Chinese. Chairman Mao. Yeah, for a while, in the early days, he would spend time in Russia too. So the reason he didn't end up teaching in an American university was it was during the McCarthy era. And he was coming and going. And so he was employed by the University of Washington, teaching only Prajnaparamita, no Marxism, nothing else, just Buddhism. And he was at Wisconsin. That's where a lot of these Prajnaparamita studies spread out from. Then he was at the University of Washington, then he was at Berkeley for 3 or 4 years. And he came down to Santa Barbara, UCSB, in I can't remember, it's in the 70s somewhere. And I had the honor of driving him down in my little Volkswagen with his wife, Muriel. He was also no, we won't go into that. Let's get back to the Prajnaparamita. There's I have a lot of anecdotes about being with him, but
I'm just curious, was he a Buddhist teacher?
he took up Buddhism on his own,
Yeah,
based on,
then,
no,
yeah.
it was based on the Parliament. And he did that during the war, because as a German, as a German refugee, he was not allowed to, he wasn't invited to join the offensive against the Nazis, so he had nothing to do. He stayed in England for those 4 years and practiced Buddhism, went into retreat throughout most of the years of the war, although he was also he was given the job of telling people growing foods whether they were growing the right food or not. He was given a government assignment. And so he said, can you imagine going out into the countryside and seeing somebody growing something they weren't supposed to be growing because we needed foods for the soldier, and telling them you're not growing the right thing in a heavy German accent with a little mustache right here. If you look at the picture of him on the Wikipedia, he doesn't look like Hitler, but he has that fashion about him. And he goes out to these British farmers. I'm getting into. Speaking of contradictions, which is what the sutra is about. So it has a major place in history. And this is what Konzo wrote about using language. We talk about shikantaza and being quiet and meditating. But what's the place of language? So this is Konzo's comment on language. Very short. Konzo says, everything that is at all worth knowing is contained in the Hridaya Heart Sutra. But it can be found there only if spiritual insight is married to intellectual ability and coupled with a delight in the use of the intellect. The sutra, it is true, points to something that lies far beyond the intellect. But the way to get to that is to follow the intellect as far as it will take you. And the dialectical logic of the sutra enables the intellect, working through language, to carry the understanding a stage further than the conceptual thinking based on ordinary logic can do. So that's his justification for spending all this time working on these texts. At the end of the war, you find, well, no, I'm going to stay away from him for a while. So the way the Red Pine approaches this is by dividing the sutra into 4 parts. I forgot to say this at the beginning. It would be helpful if people had our chant books.
Okay. And Heart Sutra is on page 4.
Okay.
Bill, do you need a copy?
No, I'm going to use this.
Okay.
No, I have a question just to clarify something you said.
Say that again.
I have a question just to see if you can clarify something that you said. So in other traditions, when they chant mantras, they speak about how when you're chanting it and you continue to do that, which is a certain kind of study with it, that it's actually the energy, the essence, the vibration, you hear that term too, from the words themselves spoken in that language that that has an effect on the person by, repeating that over and over again. Is that also contained within what you're talking about? Because I'm curious if you're studying this and reciting this, and of course in one language, versus another, if that's talked about.
That's in fact the very basis of the flow of this sutra.
That's what I was assuming, but I didn't want to make that assumption until I
And
asked.
that's in part 4.
Okay,
This is an evolution, the evolution of the teaching, starting with the earliest teaching by the Buddha. That's in part 2. But as we go through them, he'll bring you all the way in. This text takes us all the way to the mantra, which is the answer to all the previous problems that arise with the dialectic. You lay out one thing and then you contradict it and you move to a different level. And you go through that 3 or 4 times in the Heart Sutra. So what seems like a disorganized mass of concepts and technical terms is actually following the history of the evolution of Buddhist teachings through Mahayana, finally to the mantras and chanting. And that's where this sound really becomes important, is in gate, gate, paragate, parasangate. That's a mantra. But it also can be translated into English, and no one ever does that. We'll do that. So yeah. Okay, so we're going to do the first part. And I'll read Red Pine's summation of what that is. In the first part, lines 1 to 11, it ends with, when we read the sutra, I'll tell you where it ends. We are reminded of the time when the Buddha transmitted his entire understanding of the Abhidharma. Abhidharma is translated as matrix of reality. During the 7th monsoon following his enlightenment. Monsoons were the times when all of the monks came together because they couldn't travel. There was too much rain. So they would gather and they would gather in one place, and the Buddha would teach. So in the 7th, after his enlightenment, he teaches the matrix of reality. We then consider Avalokiteshvara's reformulation of such instruction to correct Shariputra's misunderstanding of it. When we say Shari, she, or Shariputra, same thing. That's who Avalokiteshvara is talking to. We'll get into who Avalokiteshvara is in a minute. The basis of this reformulation is the teaching of prajna in place of jnana. Jnana is cognate with Greek, well, Latin, Greek, gnosis, Gnosis. So this is prajna, wisdom, as opposed to jnana, knowledge. Wisdom rather than knowledge. Thus, the conceptual truths on which early Buddhism relied for their practice are held up to the light and found to be empty of anything that would separate them from the individual fabric of what is truly real. In their place, Avalokiteshvara introduces us to emptiness, the common denominator for the mundane, the metaphysical, and the transcendent. That's a mouthful. That's the first one. Now let's look at the first part 1 in the sutra. And I'll read Red Pine's translation. And you should be able to follow fairly easily there'll be differences, but the differences are interesting. Why does Red Pine translate something the way he does it that's not in what you read? So here's the first part. The noble Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, while practicing the deep practice of Prajnaparamita, looked upon the 5 skandhas and seeing they were empty of self-existence, said, "Here, Shariputra, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not separate from form. Form is not separate from emptiness. Whatever is form is emptiness. Whatever is emptiness is form." The same holds for sensation, perception, memory, and consciousness. Here, Shariputra, all dharmas are defined by emptiness, not birth or destruction, purity or defilement, completeness or deficiency. That's where it stops. You follow that on the text we're reading.
Mhm.
What's the last line on that?
Without gain, without loss.
Yeah. So this was the teaching that the Buddha is accredited having spoken on the 7th monsoon gathering of the monks. But at the same time, Avalokiteshvara holds this up to the light, says, red pine, and shows that it's all empty. Every one of those is empty. Empty of what? That's what the sutra goes into. Most importantly, empty of the self in the first one. There's a real phenomenal world out there, but the self, there's no self in it. There's no self in us or any place else. It's all mutual.
Sorry, could you define empty? That's a problem for a lot.
It always is, yeah.
So.
It doesn't mean hollow. It doesn't mean nothing. It means everything is interdependent. And where you draw the lines between all these independent entities is varies. It depends on who you are and where you are. Best example I have of that is take a key. Anybody have a car key? You don't use car keys anymore.
I got house keys too.
Fob, you have the big enough fob.
I don't need a key. This is a key, right? We can distinguish this from everything else. It's a key. But it's not a key without a lock. It's just a piece of metal. And the lock isn't anything without a door. And a door isn't anything without a wall. And a wall isn't anything without ground on to stand on until it needs the entire universe to be a key. That's mutual codependence. So there's no essence to this key without the existence of a lock. So you say, well, we know what it is. Scientifically, it's a piece of metal. But what's the metal? It's a composite of various other things. So it's all mutual interdependence. That's what emptiness is. Emptiness of an essence or self. And in the first teaching that we just read about, the main point was the human being has no self, but there are entities out there called dharmas that are real and external and material. That's what Avalokiteshvara corrects. No, even those are empty. Everything around us is empty. Therefore, codependent on everything else.
Yes. Is impermanence also emptiness?
Impermanence is empty as well. The text even say that. That's why we get to the fourth one where we chant the mantra. And it's when we get to the mantra that'll become more clear. But no, the main emptiness, ill, dukkha, suffering, and impermanence were the three main teachings of early on. But the lack of self is what Avalokiteshvara is going after. So I was going to time this.
We've got 20 minutes
Yeah,
till noon, and then we could do Q&A. Does that work for you?
we can do it even sooner if we go through this.
Okay.
So we go to part 2. in the second part, lines 12 to 20 in this book. We don't have numbers on the lines. Avalokiteshvara lists the major conceptual categories of the Sarvastan Abhidharma. These obviously need definition, but as we said earlier on what he said in the introduction, the Sarvastivadins were a major school of Buddhist practice in India. And Abhidharma was their text. But the second part goes through the Abhidharma just as the Sarvastivadins had arranged it. So it has a regular order, following the same sequence of categories used by the Sarvastivadins themselves. Avalokiteshvara reviews such forms of analysis as bodies of awareness, abodes of sensation, elements of perception, chain of dependent origination, the four truths, and the attainment of non-attainment or non-attainment of Buddha, of nirvana, and sees them all dissolve in emptiness, including emptiness. Swallows itself. So let's read that section. That's the section. What you're reading are the assertions that it pre-existed this text by the Sarvastivadins and their rejection by Avalokiteshvara. Therefore, Shariputra was the wisest of the Buddhist disciples. He was the expert on the Abhidharma. So we got the right guy. This is the guy you want to go after if you're going to unpack the early teaching. In emptiness, there is no form, no sensation, no perception, no memory, and no consciousness. Notice how different his translation is than what you're reading there. I'll read that again. In empties, there is no form, that's the same. No sensation, no perception, no memory, that's different. And no consciousness, maybe a little bit more understandable. Then he goes on to no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, and no mind, no shape, no sound, no smell, no taste, no feeling, no thought. Keep the key in mind. Remember the key, that's why there is no taste. There's no essence to taste. No element of perception from the eye to conceptual consciousness. No causal link, causal, from ignorance to old age and death. No end of causal link from ignorance to old age and death. No suffering, no source, no relief, no path, no knowledge, no attainment, no non-attainment. Okay, it's time to go home. Nothing's left.
No.
He's- There's no home to go to, and there's no one to go to it.
There's no one to go to.
So that was,
So those are all the key, like the key. They don't exist without connection to something else.
yeah, so that's why, yeah. Let's stop there. Go down a rabbit hole with that one.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
So he's not saying that we don't experience these things. In fact, he says that's what it all is. It's all experience in here. There's nothing out there that we can say anything exists essentially as being existing. So we go on now to the third part. This is where Mahayana comes in. In the third part, Avalokiteshvara turns from the Sarvastivadin interpretation of the Abhidharma to the emptiness of Prajnaparamita, which provides travelers with all they need to reach the goal of Buddhahood. Part 3, that's all you need. Here, Avalokiteshvara reviews the major signposts near the end of the path without introducing additional conceptual categories that might obstruct or deter those who would travel it. So let's read that one. Therefore, Shariputra, this is the Bodhisattva path. Without attainment, bodhisattvas take refuge in the Prajnaparamita and live without walls of the mind, without walls of the mind, and thus without fears. They see through the delusions and finally achieve nirvana. They see through the delusions and nirvana. Finally, nirvana, it says here, but nirvana is also seen through. All Buddhas, past, present, and future, also take refuge in Prajnaparamita and realize unexcelled perfect enlightenment. That's the third one. And the fourth one. Avalokiteshvara leaves us with a summary of the teachings of the Prajnaparamita in the form of an incantation that reminds and empowers us to go beyond conceptual categories. That's why it's a mantra. This teaching has, with good reason, been called the mother of Buddhas. Having survived a year-long journey through the jungle of early Buddhism to the secret burial ground of Abhidharma, this is Red Pine talking. I would add that the Heart Sutra is the womb out of which Buddhas are born and bodhisattvas. With this incantation ringing in our minds, we thus enter the goddess Prajnaparamita. That's the answer to the question I asked at the beginning. What's Prajnaparamita doing in there with bodhisattvas, mahasattvas? It's a goddess. It's represented in all of the icons as a female. It's the mother, it's the womb that holds, out of which and arise Buddhas and bodhisattvas. So, with this incantation ringing in our minds, we thus enter the goddess Prajnaparamita and await our rebirth as Buddhas. This is the teaching of the Heart Sutra as I have come to understand it over the past year. So those are the 4 parts. So there's a system here and there's a progression from the earliest period to the state of Buddhahood. Now I want to touch on just one more, the first line, as an example of what you would find here. If you were to explore it further. The teaching of the sutra is known as Prajnaparamita. The word prajna is Sanskrit for wisdom and is a combination of pra, meaning before, and jna, meaning to know. From the same combination, the Greeks got prognosis, P-R-O, prognosis. Gnosis is wisdom. Wisdom is cognate with jhana. But while the Greeks referred to the knowledge of what lies before us, namely the future course of events, the Buddhists of ancient India referred to what comes before knowledge. Shinryu Suzuki called it the beginner's mind. In the centuries after the Buddha's nirvana, however, the focus on cultivation was on knowledge rather than on prajna. Members of the earliest Buddhist sects held that reality was a complex system of dharmas and could be known, and liberation depended on such knowledge. It would appear that this was a reaction that this was in reaction to this emptiness, emphasis on jhana. Contemplation of Prajna texts occurred, focusing on wisdom as opposed to knowledge. Although opinions vary as to when the texts before us were compiled, the use of Prajna in the title tells us this is a text that goes beyond analysis of reality into discrete, knowable entities, namely dharmas, such as those used by the Sarastavadas. The Zen masters asked their students to show them their original face, the face before they were born. Distinguish the third level of prajna, namely wisdom, perfect wisdom, one we're studying. To distinguish the third level of prajna from mundane and metaphysical wisdom, it is called prajna paramita. According to the early commentators, there are two possible derivations for the meaning paramita. Prajna paramita scriptures, like the Diamond Sutra, in sutras like the Diamond Sutra, it is evident that the usage elsewhere in the same text that the author derived paramita from parama, meaning highest point or perfection. So perfection of prajna. Thus, prajna paramita means the perfection of wisdom. But we can also deduce from the use of para in the mantra at the end of the Heart Sutra that the author of this text interpreted the word paramita as a combination of para, meaning beyond, and ita, meaning gone. Thus, according to this interpretation, paramita means what has gone beyond, what is transcendent, or according to the Chinese translations, what leads us to the other shore. Also ita, because ita here is feminine. These are the languages unlike English, gender. Paramita means she who has gone beyond. It's a female. Because ita here is feminine, paramita means she who has gone beyond, she who leads us to the other shore. She, in this case, referring to Prajna Paramita, the personified goddess of wisdom. So that's Prajna Paramita in the title. And lastly, what about practice? Practicing the deep Prajna Paramita. I'll read this one and then we can open it up and raise questions or do whatever we want to do. So the first line is while practicing, in this section is while practicing the deep practice of Prajna Paramita. The word chara, which is practice, is both a verb and a direct object. It means practice the practice, to walk the walk. In early texts, the Buddhist disciples were distinguished as to whether they were still training, no longer needed training. And the Buddha teachings were referred to as training, systems of training, shiksha. Thus, Buddhism is better understood. This is an important line, I think. Thus, Buddhism is better understood as a skill or an art to be practiced and perfected, rather than as information or knowledge to be learned or amassed. Well, Prajna Paramita is sometimes personified as a goddess of the same name. More often, this refers to the teaching that gave rise to Mahayana Buddhism. This new approach, born with yogic insight rather than philosophical speculation, involved the dissolution of the analytical categories without establishing new categories. Take their place. Thus, teaching of the Prajnaparamita could be characterized as Lao Tzu did the Tao. The way that becomes the way is not the eternal way. The name that becomes the name is not the eternal name. Still, Lao Tzu proceeded to write 81 verses on what has no name, and the Buddhas likely spoke at great length about Prajnaparamita. And with that, I will stop talking.
Thank you, Bill. Really, really helpful.
I have a question. Actually, it's kind of a two-parter. It's this. Thank you, by the way. That was very insightful, because all these months I've been sitting and practicing, just going, what is this stuff? That kind of opened up. So you mentioned Mahayana at the end there. And I hear the word Maha in that, and that's the one word I keep seeing that, like, we've broken it down everything. What is Maha?
It just means great.
Great. Okay. So, and then the other.
So it's an honorific.
Okay, got it. I'm as saying this is the Great Sutra. Just see. Okay, and then the other thing I was curious about, you mentioned how prajna, being wisdom, is to, I guess, replace jnana, which is knowledge. And you mentioned how jnana has, in a language translation for us, has the gnosis, like prognosis or diagnosis. And you broke down prajna, but does prajna have a similar translation in Greek or Latin that is?
The closest that comes to it is gnosis. Just
Oh, okay,
gnosis.
it all leads back to that.
And so pra was added to push it beyond just knowledge.
Oh, I got it. Okay, got it.
This surpasses knowledge.
I see.
It's a wisdom that's inexpressible, and we'll talk about it for the next year.
Very interesting. Okay, that clarifies.
Oh,
Thank you.
Oh, you can go ahead.
No, you, please.
So, so emptiness, interdependence. First of all, are they synonymous? And second of all, are they absolute? Is that absolute truth or relative truth? Or is it end up being both?
It ends up being both. And let's start again. What was the first thing you?
Are they synonymous, interdependence and emptiness?
No, they're dependent on each other.
Okay.
Because as soon, and everything, every time you put up a concept, it doesn't take much effort to find that it's defined in terms of other things. So it's dependent on other things in order to be what we think it is. So we draw these lines in places that are important to us when we are studying Buddhism or studying anything. And we need to do that. We can't, it's too much. The big lump is too much without breaking it down into pieces. But those pieces are artificial. They're apparent reality, and they're useful. In the beginning, you start with those, but you know they're provisional. They're only temporary. They're here now until you get to the next step. So those divisions will inevitably, we can't escape divisions, and that's samsara. That's the world we're in. Can't escape those. So emptiness itself is a concept, and it has to dissolve. You have to. There's the text is saying that you can practice prajna without conceptualizing prajna. So that's why he's emphasizing practice and sound and mantras. Is picking some of those ideas up. So that's where you were going, I think, with the last mantra thing.
And ritual, right?
What?
And ritual, in the way that.
Ritual, yeah.
For chanting, using form.
Does anybody have any deep insights based on this illuminating discussion?
I think one of the things that's come up for me lately, and it's interesting that you're speaking of this today, so it's more what I'm saying is my desire to try to hold this, relate with it. And that is it's a movement rather than anything fixed. It's kind of like the particle in the wave when that's talked about, or the consciousness that's aware of when it's focused and when it comes out. And it's the one that's watching that which is focused. And so it's resting in, I'm still kind of working with this. So it almost to me feels like to ever try to make it static is impossible. It really is sitting in the space of how those two are if they're not even two, but for the sake of me trying to describe this, how they're coexisting at all times and moving in and out. And so being able to be in that space where you are noticing that they're doing that.
Things change all the time.
There you go. And not that you're taking one side or the other, thinking, getting back into the thinking. It's being able to sit in that space. And even saying the word movement thing could conjure up another conversation around that, because I'm not fixing it. I'm trying to actually describe something that's more in my body. It's like the embodiment of something. I mean, even when I repeat things like this, there's something inside me that knows that it's what I'm repeating is almost attempting to wear me down to the point where it's just, I let go of all of it. And then I exist within that space I'm trying to describe.
Well said. Non-attachment. The Bodhisattva is not attached either to emptiness or forms. It doesn't hold either one of them. That's actually part of the sutra as well. So you let go. That's actually where the path leads. Is letting go of view. It's called views. Having views, drishti. Drishti is a fixed concept of something and believing that that's right. They're provisional, they're functional. Not functional, that's not a good description, but they're provisional. And actually it'll go on and argue, and this I just throw this out, I'm not sure I understand this completely, but they exist simultaneously. That's the mystery of the Prajnaparamita. Both the existence of emptiness and the existence of form simultaneously. Form was an example. All of the dharmas, all of the skandhas are empty. So form was just the first one. The eye sees form. They are mutually dependent. But this all happens within the brain, within the mind. You never get out in the real world. You're working through the brain all the time. So the external world can exist in the brain as well as the internal world. This is also part of the argument. It's all through receptors and transformation. I just got my eyes done, got the those little lenses put in. Cataract surgery. And I went back to the doctor last week and I said, everything now has a kind of blue cast to it. So it doesn't seem natural. I remember when there were reds and yellows, a lot much more vibrant. And he said, actually, you're much closer to the more direct way the eye works than what you thought you were seeing. The oranges and reds. So the eye is processing everything right at the beginning. Colors change and then it gets mixed up with karma, previous experience, associations. And so by the time the concept gets to surface in your consciousness, it's gone through 3 or 4 filters before it gets there. So that's why we go back and read the concept. Don't get attached to either the form or the emptiness. conceptual.
Well, I think the challenge, and we've seen over years from myself and others in Western cultures, is when, and I think it's a good thing in certain ways when psychology came in to kind of bolster these teachings, is that people misinterpreted what non-attachment means. And that's a whole other conversation, but I think there's a reason why I love that Dalai Lama quote when he talks about it's about cultivating the heart. You spend too much time in the West cultivating the mind, which is so interesting for Buddhists to say, since they're saying this is like the science of the mind, but that, everyone really held, including myself, held on to that. What does that mean then, cultivating our heart more so that we can hold all these teachings? Yeah, it's a challenge, I think, in this culture. Not the non-attachment part, not just what's obvious on the surface, but the actual staying connected with life, letting life in. Wow, living everything you've been talking about today.
Yeah, I like the comment that Red Pine makes here, is that Buddhism is more about a practice than a body of knowledge or wisdom.
Bill, I'm keeping the trains on time here. We're going to have one more question in the room, and then we'll ask anybody online if they have a question, and then we'll wrap up. So, Ken?
I just, I've always wondered, has there been any study of the grand delusion, which would be form is no other than form, emptiness no other than emptiness?
Yes,
So
they put that combination together.
and
That's, in fact, that happens in a lot of the Zen discussions later on. Form is nothing but form. That's a later Mahayana elaboration of some of these ideas in other sects of Mahayana Buddhism.
so it gives a kind of a contrast,
Yeah,
because I would imagine that Buddha would not expound form is no other than emptiness if everyone was not under the delusion that form was no other than form.
this gets involved. That's why it would be worth, if the way one studies this text is not this was a summary. I think one has to go into each line in depth. I like the first line. Avalokitesha was practicing the deep Rajana Paramita. Anything that you pick up can be viewed through either the form or the non-form perspective, or both simultaneously. And that's going deep rather than just remembering a few facts about what emptiness is. So actually, a lot of the later Chan and Zen texts rely more on images of form than concepts. Visual stories. Okay.
We have time for one more question, and does anyone in Zoom land there have a question or a weigh-in that they'd like to share? All right. Thank you. Well, and non-verbally communicated there, Bob. Thank you. Okay. Bill, thank you so much. This was really, really helpful. The Heart Sutra is such a profound and at the same time challenging sutra for us, and we work with it all the time. This is really, really nice way to start looking at it in a little different way. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Grateful.
Yeah, I'm grateful that you wanted to hear about it.
Yeah. Well, I think we usually close by chanting the 4 vows, and we'll do that together, and then we'll do a little bit of housekeeping in terms of announcements, and then we'll put the room back together. So Michael, do you want to lead us in the chanting of the 4 vows?
Sure, I think.
Or Elisa, whoever wants to do that.
I know I need bells, yeah.
Okay,
I'll go over here again.
okay.
Lisa, do you want?
Yeah, it's page 41.
Page 41. Sentient beings are numberless. I got to save them. Desires are inexhaustible. I bound to put an end to them. Regardless of boundless, I vow to master them. The little way is unsurpassable. I vow to attain it. Shoujo Buddhan Seikando Sanchi Seikanda Wo Yo Seikando Mujo Seikando. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to save them. Desires are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Limits are boundless. I vow to master them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to attain